Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 16th of October and today we're going through the past 4 days of events. So much has unfolded. We're going to break it down one by one, front by front, beginning with the city of Pokrovsk. Then from there, Myrnohrad. We'll then zoom in on the Dobropillya pockets, Kostyantynivka and Kupyansk. Then we'll circle back down and look at what's going on in the direction of Novopavlivka, where we had some very prescient commentary a couple of days ago. We'll then look at Zaporizhzhia and the Yanchor River line. To finish off, we'll discuss the phone call between Trump and Putin and the meeting that was supposed to go on tomorrow and everything related to the tomahawks. I'll do that very briefly and perhaps I'll talk about it over the weekend, but I do want to get into the actual frontline changes right now. So let's zoom in on what's going on in the city itself. There were 3 major advances occurring along the direct southern flank and then also to the west and east. There's a lot of movement. Let's begin over here with this update and this video that dropped. It's from the Horns of Dovbush drone units, which is a part of the 68th Jaeger Brigade, a unit that I have stationed over here, but it's not too unrealistic for them to have drone elements and operators that are also fighting along the western edge and western access points into the city. So they conducted FPV strikes and targeted houses and dachas that are along the western chunk of the Durniak microdistrict. Let's actually show you guys the confines of the microdistrict. Because for the past month now, there's been a campaign waged by first Russian DRGs, and now it appears as if there are regular Russian assault companies involved in the storming of houses within this microdistrict. And it's an area that's more open. There are a lot of routes that enter into it that are difficult for Ukrainian drone crews to consistently stop. They can do it at first, but eventually, after a certain amount of volume, the front line becomes porous and troops can filter in. So at that point, they're able to actually seep into the basements, and at that point, it's very difficult to get them out unless there's an organized counterattack on the ground. So Russian forces took over the cemetery area. There was a bit of back and forth along the western edge of the Durniak microdistrict over the past week, but the Russians have been able to evidently take it over and use that as a building block to then move northwestwards into some of these rural areas. There may be some agricultural houses over here and warehouses. The rest of the Durniak district is under Ukrainian control. You can see how the areas closer to the E50 highway remain marked as blue, but the Russians, with this new geolocation, they're getting very close to the E50 highway. They're only about 800 meters away, and that's a really important road used to enter into the city, so it's important for supplying the entire pockets, including Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad and everything in between. And then also for movement within the city itself, it's very important for connectivity between, say, the road over here, Prokofiev Street, and then the Ukrainian forces defending to the southeast, in Shakhtarsky, in Sonyachny, and in numerous other high-rise apartment buildings. So the fact that the Russians have been able to pursue a vector of advance over here is significant. Now it's a matter of retaining control, expanding to get control over the entire Durniak microdistrict, because then that will allow the Russians to expand their footprint into the heartland of Pokrovsk, something that they've not been able to do in a meaningful way so far, and then also to threaten the supply lines. That's something that's going to either cut off the supply lines or force the Ukrainians to redirect forces to prevent that from happening. And then the vanguard will be redirected to here, whereas there will be more openings and gaps and along other parts of the front line within the city. So just to quickly look at the advance, it's 1.74 square kilometers and an advance amounting to about 2.15 kilometers northwards at its maximum extent. And my map is very generous to the Ukrainians because I still have all of these areas south of the rail line marked in blue, even though a lot of Russian sources have for weeks now been claiming that it's under full Russian control, which would actually go part and parcel with this most recent advance, because then it would show that it's part of the sort of process that's been building up for a while and that it's not just a spontaneous attack that occurred, even though the Ukrainians are located nearby. But in any case, we are waiting for proof to see whether the Russians actually are present in these areas that we're zooming in on right now that do include some trenches. But to actually look at the concrete advances, Troyanda, we could see over here, 15 hectares of territory taken. A video from today released by the 155th Mechanized Brigade shows FPV strikes onto houses and shacks, and the Russian soldiers are filmed there. They're present within these houses as they're being struck by the FPVs. This gives us an indication that Vulitsia Gvitkova is actually under Russian control. That Troyanda, this really important stepping stone, is now an area the Russians can use as a forward base because, of course, Leontovichi serves as that feeding point into the Pokrovsk meat grinder. You have to advance along Vulitsia Zotova and then along Vulitsia Privolna. And then from there, you can arrive at the market district being around here near the hospital region. And Troyanda was another access point that Russian DRGs used over 2 waves, but were pushed out of numerous times. Now they've been able to retake it in its entirety. And from there, if Russians are able to, they can either make this move eastwards and arrive at the dachas just to the west of the apartment complex, or they can also move northwards towards these forested areas, and that's also adjacent to the Jubilee Park. And then from there, they're able to use that concealment in order to cross over the highway, arrive at the market district from another location, and then from there, you're already at the heartland of the city of Pokrovsk. So just another route for the Russians to use in another location where the Ukrainians are getting stretched thin. And by the way, just remember, this is all happening as the Russians are downscaling their presence over here. They've moved numerous very important brigades away from Pokrovsk, away from southern, not eastern, but southern Pokrovsk, to be precise. Like this unit over here, 35th, and not this one, but the 137th Assault Brigade, for instance. And there are a couple of others, like the 55th Mountain Rifle Brigade. So there are 4 units that previously were stationed to the south of the city, around Shevchenko and around, for instance, Pishane. They've now been redirected to the west to get involved in an offensive towards Novopavlivka. But despite that fact, the Russians are still advancing and are advancing at an even faster pace because the Ukrainians, the attritional load is reaching the point of no return, and that's why the gains are beginning to maximize. The Ukrainians are starting to withdraw from the locations they simply cannot hold on to anymore. The Russians are taking advantage of it, obviously, even with a smaller force composition, but you still have the 30th Brigade operating here, and there are a couple of others that I'm clicking on from the 27th Motor Rifle Division, most notably, but you can see them over here on the map. And that's a look into the last advance from the southern flank. The Russians captured today Novopavlivka, this really important village, because it's on E50 highway, for instance. So from here, the Russians can take advantage of the windbreaks and the rail line and also the highway itself to reach the southeastern tip of the city. And from there, infiltrate Zaporizhzhia from the flank, or to infiltrate Hanativka, or use the road to push into Pokrovsk along what's referred to as Vulitsia Shoseyna road. So that's along the eastern sort of flank of the city as well. So a lot of opportunities simply due to this advance over here that is once again undermining Ukraine's defensive rigidity. You can look at the capture over here and see that it amounts to 5.14 square kilometers, so it is very notable. Looking at the advance eastwards, it amounts to about 3.5 kilometers, and then just vertically, the push from Novoukrainka all the way into the southern parts of the apartment complexes, it's about 2.6 kilometers. So at this point, it's become pretty much certain that Vulitsia Kievska is under Russian control. And also this is Zelenivka microdistrict, and the adjacent garages, dachas, and even some of the high-rises in this location have fallen under Russian control. But there is still this solid Ukrainian line that is defending the entrance point into Shakhtarsky. So that's where the demarcation point is at right now. But there is a major Russian bulge now due to the capture of Novopavlivka. So then the Ukrainians are in this exposed position to the south. And this is an area they were able to defend really well for months, despite a lot of pressure. But now Lysivka is going to be in trouble because the connectivity between Lysivka and then Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad is getting weaker and weaker by the day. And Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad themselves are already in a difficult situation. So it's almost like a pocket within a pocket. So it's getting even more difficult to defend over there, especially with the northwestern flank now being undermined. So a lot of the holes are not getting exposed within this pocket, and so we're seeing for the first time a lot of the sort of ancillary parts of the front line, the areas that were always considered secondary, that weren't really important, and where troops weren't really deployed to the same degree. Those areas are beginning to buckle under the pressure, and that's really signified with this area over here to the east of Myrnohrad. The Russians have embarked upon a campaign to really take control over the villages near the city, and they've succeeded in doing so to a certain degree. So, for instance, they've been sending a lot of forces from Mykolaievka and then advancing along this paved road and then making their way to Balakhan. So Balakhan's currently contested, but they are trying to take it over in its entirety. And that's been the case since October 11th. So the 38th Marine Brigade is the Ukrainian force trying to repel all of this, and the Argus drone unit has been very involved, publishing a lot of imagery and footage. And they also released on October 13th a video of a strike on an MTLB east of Balakhan. So that confirmed to us that the Russians were pushing along this tree line. So they are, in effect, in control of everything to the north of it as well. So Mikhailivka in its entirety is fully under Russian control, 5.4 square kilometers worth of territory captured. In terms of the vertical advance from the Kazanitsarets River, it's about 2.14 kilometers southwards, and that closes in other pockets. Now, the major pocket left is the one that's sort of stretching out of Kozatsk and Promyn. You could see that there are a couple of trenches and tree lines. There's also this paved road running along this adjacent tree line, and then you have this mining facility and shaft. I don't know if it's under Ukrainian control anymore. It appears to be in a gray zone, but there are some positions over here being used as forward outposts, and they can only hold out when there's no significant pressure on the ground. Now that the Russians are going to start consolidating in areas like Balakhan or near the dachas over here, that's going to give them a platform to exert pressure from the north, and the goal will be to close this pocket in its entirety. Now, some Russian sources claim that it has already been closed, but that would be a significant development. It would be a lot of surface area captured, and so it would necessitate proof of consensus from sources or footage, and that's why I've always been very cautious when, reporting on those claims. Like, I'll still tell you guys about it, but I'm not going to change the map to indicate that if I don't believe it in my heart of hearts. But you guys can see that naturally from here, Kozatsk, Promyn are in danger. Myrnohrad itself is also an area that's, it's a pretty wide village in certain locations, but it's also very thin over here, for instance. Like, this is a location that can be severed, for instance. If you're looking at it from a tactical perspective, just to measure, the northern and southern parts of Myrnohrad are only connected by a vertical road moving southwards, just one road, and then a couple of dachas, and maybe they're not dachas, but they're just these low-rise houses, just one-story houses, and it spans about 500 meters before you reach the western edge. So that's a location that could be cut off theoretically. But regardless of that, the pressure is beginning to really mount over here, and so the Ukrainians are forced to concentrate their forces on defending the outer perimeter of the city. So all the outskirts, all of the nearby towns, those are the ones that are falling first. But the perimeter, including the trenches, those are locations the Ukrainians are holding on to. 79th Air Assault Brigade is operating over here with at least one of the battalions of the 82nd Brigade, even though the 82nd is also fighting way further to the north in the Dobropillya pockets. But that's pretty much it when it comes to Myrnohrad in terms of what's confirmed. Now, I want to look at the Dobropillya pocket, as I said, but let's look first at what's going on over here. The Russians have been able to retake much of Dorozhny. So the Ukrainians, as we know, they conducted a counterattack, a localized one. It was at the beginning of October, it was repelled, and then since then, there's been an effort by the Russians to just cleanse the Ukrainian DRGs and the pocket operating around Myrnohrad. And we could say that as of 4 days ago, they were successful. So all of Myrnohrad has fallen into Russian hands. 2.3 square kilometers of territory worth has fallen into their hands as well, and 3.5 kilometers westwards. That's the advance. This video over here from October 16th, it shows a compilation video from the Phoenix FPV group. It's a part of the National Guard, and they destroyed a motorcycle, a car, 3 trucks, 1 armored vehicle, 3 FPVs in interceptions, and a communication antenna, and also just struck Russian targets in houses near Dorozhny. So that would include over here the northern tip where you have the rail line and the quarry station. So we have proof now via video footage of the Russians over here. They're going to try to take it over in its entirety, and that will close the entire circle and ensure there's no possibility of any further DRG infiltrations through these forested areas into Myrnohrad and by extension into the Kazanitsarets River Valley to the east. And that's really important because the situation supply-wise for the Russians has really improved over here in recent weeks. We can now say that the maximum width for the Dobropillya pockets is about 8 kilometers. And again, it's not the most ideal. Like, there's not many paved roads passing through this area, but in terms of just the fields that are now safe in relative terms, because again, drone crews can operate to the east and west and cover all of those 8 kilometers. But it is far safer than it was even going back to the beginning of the month. And so that's a major improvement. And now, just for the Russian perspective, they need to shore off Dorozhny and the area to its south where you have these trench networks. On the other hand, they're really trying to close the Kazanitsarets pockets. And so now the Ukrainians are on the defense. They've endured 3 major mechanized attacks over the past couple of days. I think since October 9th it was. So it's been a week. And these are being embarked upon by the Marine units. So the 40th, the 177th, the 155th, and 61st. Those are the ones doing this. 61st to a bit of a lesser degree, but the other ones are intimately involved in this. And based on the geolocations from the assault that occurred on October 13th, that I think I discussed, but I think that I never really changed the map in its entirety, the Russian forces from 3 motorized brigades, 1 Marine brigade, they tried to assault Chekhove from the east, and I'll just reread it again so you guys can see, even if I did mention it last video, 1 tank and 17 armored vehicles were utilized. The Ukrainian air assault forces operating over here. You have the 8th and 7th air assault corps that are deployed to this region at this point that are giving statements on a day-to-day basis about this part of the front line. They claim that 1 tank and 12 vehicles were damaged/destroyed. And so, again, that's ambiguous. They didn't say that they were all destroyed. They say some were damaged. And then the 100 Russians were quote-unquote destroyed. And so, again, that can mean a lot. It can mean injured. It could mean targeted, etc. But the geolocations of the damaged, the destroyed Russian vehicles, including MTLBs, BTRs, and such, they indicate that the Russians captured 9.11 square kilometers, a diagonal advance of about 5.2 kilometers northwest. The advance itself occurred along this paved road. So, like, let's say they advanced along this route, then they took a right turn, and from there tried storming the eastern outskirts of Shehove. Now, they were stopped at the entrance, so Shehove itself is still under Ukrainian control, but the Russians got awfully close to it. And in the process, all of the Ukrainian positions in trenches, in anti-tank ditches, in tree lines that are located south of that mechanized assault, they were abandoned, and there was no feasible way for them to remain over there. And so they've withdrawn towards Shehove itself. So Shehove now is a bit of a refuge for all these withdrawing Ukrainian units. And so that's going to be the next target for the Russians as they try to get control over all Volodymyrivka. And they pursue these vectors of assault, not just from this road, which is a bit to the north, but also along this route, which is a major route, this major paved road that leads directly to Volodymyrivka, or not directly to it, but just to the east of it, and then from there directly into Shehove. So there was an attempted assault by the Russians that occurred yesterday, night of October 15th. And that was supposed to be the major hit that would allow the Russians to take over Shehove and then precipitate the entire collapse of the pocket. But the Ukrainians from the 1st National Guard Corps, Azov, were able to repel it, and they repelled it pretty far away from the line of contact. It was around here, I would say. That's the general location. So you can see what they were doing. They sort of dismounted, or took a left turn on the T0504 highway over here. Then from there, they passed Novopavlivka and then arrived pretty close to Popivyar. So these are areas on the Russian rear. But regardless, they were spotted and targeted prematurely. And that was done using HIMARS, artillery systems, and FPVs. So out of 22 vehicles used, 9 armored fighting vehicles were destroyed and 4 were damaged. So that attack dissipated, but all it will take now, because of how close the Russians really are to Shehove, all it would take is one successful mechanized assault, and even a couple of vehicles passing through would be successful within this definition, because then the troops would get dismounted over there and they would seep into the basements, and the surface area is so small that it would actually permit for a full capture. So that's the intention of the Russians now. They're going to repeat this now every couple of days. Looking eastwards at Kostyantynivka, 2 events occurred. First of all, the Ukrainian DRGs and forward elements that were defending in these forested areas very close to the Donbass Canal, they've fully withdrawn by now, and this has been a drawn-out process occurring for weeks. But at this point, it is confirmed. So 7.36 square kilometers of territory was taken over by the Russians during this time. Major pocket that is closed. This will allow for far more connectivity and streamlined communication between Stopochki and all of the other areas south of Chasiv Yar, and then the outskirts of Toretsk to the north. So there's going to be a lot of more coordination in lieu of the assaults in the direction of Kostyantynivka. So in terms of the advance westwards, we can see over here geolocation on October 16th. Ukrainian drone dropped a grenade onto a house northeast of the Santorinivka microdistrict. That microdistrict, the Santorinivka district, is located over here roughly. Maybe it extends to here as well. I'm not sure right now. But it is in this area, and it is an important region because it would serve as the first step into the city. And the Russians are very clearly angling for an assault over here because they already have control over the Yahika microdistrict with the dachas to the southeast. Now the northeastern flank is being pursued as a potential option. So forces have been able to use Pertichny as the launch pad and are entering into these houses over here in the rural areas. And they're being spotted by drone crews naturally because it is an open area and being struck. But that's confirmation of an advance amounting to, let's see, about 1.4 kilometers to the west. It is important because now the pressure will be on this pocket. There's a Ukrainian pocket that is preventing small-scale connectivity, localized unity between the Yadhidka and Pertichny flanks. And so the goal, I would presume, is for the Russians to now just sort of close it out and to ensure that there is a more coherent front line that's unified in lieu of crossing over the trenches. The Ukrainians do have a lot of prepared defenses over here, and they protect the entire perimeter of the microdistrict. So the best route may just be through the areas a bit to the south, because those are locations that are slightly less dense in terms of fortifications. But regardless, there will have to be some fighting through fortifications because of the way in which the Ukrainians built the entire layout over here. Looking northwards, I'm going to see if there are any notable updates. From Serednje, there is one, so we'll zoom in on this. The Russians, they were able to advance a bit to the west of it on October 8th, and the Arton units within the main intelligence directorates, they assaulted those forward positions within the tree lines using 2 armored vehicles, and they were just firing with their machine guns. It was filmed, and that geolocation indicates an advance and a capture of 0.5 square kilometers. So that's pretty much it. I know there's a lot of rumors right now spiraling about the Liman front, about the Russians closing in on the first, or I suppose the outer line of defense protecting the city. But again, none of that is confirmed, so I've not really commented on it. And then Kupyansk, a bit of a change to the gray zone. Maybe will also change over the weekend the Russian-controlled territories as more information comes out. But for now, what is true is that the gray zone is beginning to expand yet again in the city, into the southern part of the city this time. So to the east of the Jubilee microdistrict, you can see that there is more gray zone, and it's reaching the areas near the school. And then also just to the north of Volitsia Privokzalna, there's also a lot of a gray zone over here, pretty close to the Oska River as well. So that's it when it comes to the updates from here. And again, I know there are updates from Vovchansk that people are aware of because DivGen's been reporting on it. A lot of Russian sources are mentioning the fact that, let's look at it actually so you guys can see, that there's been a connection between the Russian forces in this forest south of the Donets River and the ones that are assaulting the western part of the city, and that all of these suburban areas or just private residential areas have been taken over by the Russians as a part of a broader effort to finally seize the rest of the city. Now, this may be true, but there's just not confirmation of it yet. There's no videos from here. The only videos we've seen are from the beginning of the month, and they did show the advances of the Russians capturing about 50 hectares near the western parts of the city. But yeah, I'll certainly keep you guys updated if anything changes over there. Now to move on to the final confirmed advances for today. Novopavlivka. So look at it. The Russians are now making a serious effort to begin clearing out the outskirts of the city. And there are 2 locations where this is being done right now. First of all, to the northeast of the city, we're seeing this campaign south of Moravka. So 1.92 square kilometers of territory captured. There are 2 videos over here from the 59th Assault Brigade of FPV strikes onto individual Russian soldiers advancing along this route. They are taking advantage of the local shrubbery and trenches to advance, and the goal is to reach the border. They want to reach the border between Dnipro and Donetsk and seep into those positions, take advantage of the tree lines because they give concealment. They will use the underground positions and compartments built by the Ukrainians to evade, first of all, being seen and then being struck by the drones. But right now, they're getting very close to reaching that border region, although they've not reached it just yet. So we can see that over here, October 13th, FPV strike on a Russian soldier, and then another one over here from the same day. In terms of the advance, I'll measure it horizontally. It's about 1.2 kilometers west. And so the goal is, as I said before, to take over the fortification network protecting Novopavlivka, and then perhaps along the way to get control over the road network that also feeds into it. So that's one route, and a lot of the new reinforcements coming in from Pokrovsk, they're going to be involved in that. Moreover, we're seeing movement by Russian forces directly south of the city. And this is important because they took control of Filia, and they were able to really absorb the assaults and prevent anything from deteriorating. So they held on to Filia and have now expanded eastwards. So they captured 3.86 square kilometers of territory. And let's measure it pushing eastwards. It's an advance of about 3 kilometers to the east. There's a geolocation to back it up. So the Russians coming from Filia were able to push eastwards on October 15th. They were spotted by the 46th Air Assault Brigade that conducted grenade drops onto those forces in tree lines and also near a local anti-tank ditch. And this is very important because this anti-tank ditch is one of the only defensive structures that the Ukrainians have at their disposal over here to bear the brunt of an assault coming from the south towards the city. And it's already being taken over from the western flank, an area that was never anticipated to come under such an attack. So it's being taken over without much of a fight, especially on the ground. We're not seeing many clashes like one-on-one on the ground over here. It's just Russian forces advancing through a lot of open areas and then some hedgerows and then being struck by drone crews. So yeah, that leads to casualties, especially in the first phases when you're reaching like an area that's relatively untouched when it comes to Russian advances at a fast pace. But you can see, based on the geometry of the front line, there are a lot of pockets brewing right now. So the Russians advanced, as we said, about 3 kilometers to the east, and they've now been able to establish a solid base north of the Vovcha River that can be used to accumulate forces and then storm the city itself. First, they need to overrun this line over here. You can see it. And then there's another local line, a bit of a thinner one, but it is supposed to protect the immediate vicinity of Novopavlivka. So at the same time, you have all of this open area that used to serve as a buffer zone to protect the sort of flank to the south. But a lot of it was bypassed because the Russians never pursued attacks north of Dakhny because they were unable to. The Marines were able to hold them in their tracks, but they were not able to stop them from crossing the river near Filia and then taking it over and then advancing along the Solona River. And so that's become the point of exploitation. And as a result, invariably, the holdouts in the southern part of the buffer zone are now in a pocket over here and over here. So the end result will eventually be, and again, this is something that is just based on the geometry, it will be a closure of this pocket and then a closure of essentially everything south of the anti-tank ditch. And then the biggest advantage the Ukrainian defenders had in Novopavlivka, which was the distance from the line of contact, the distance from the Russian forces, would then dissipate. They would no longer have that advantage. There would actually be a lot of proximity between the Ukrainian forces over here and their advancing Russian opponents. Now, regardless, there is a large garrison in the city, so that is a major advantage. It is well fortified. We can see that very clearly with the map. There are still a lot of obstacles to overrun along this buffer zone region, so that's all to be kept in mind. A lot of drone crews are placed over here. A lot of artillery crews are placed in Mezhova. So a lot is going for the Ukrainians over here, but that's also a part of why the Russians want to take it over. They want to use it as the first stepping stone into Dnipro, and then from there to expand to Mezhova, for instance. That's another target. But again, we're looking way too far into the future in such a case. Around the Yancha River line, not anything too significant, just a closure of everything to the east of the river. So over here, 2.7 square kilometers of territory taken, largely open fields, some trenches, some warehouses. Around Poltavka, we talked about it already, the capture of, 1.2 square kilometers, and then an expansion north of Novopavlivka, a video from October 15th of the 3rd Battalion of the 122nd TDF Brigade conducting FPV strikes onto houses and dugouts. So that's an advance of 26 hectares. It's a part of the goal of infiltrating the eastern outskirts of Uspanivka. And to finish off with the, of course, Zaporizhzhia front. I forgot to mention this in the last video, but there was a video, of course, from the 33rd Assault Regiment and 24th Adar Assault Battalion, where they entered into northern Malay-Shocherbaki. And at the time I drew this polygon to depict what I thought was the situation on the ground, although I was not sure of it. And it turns out it exactly comports with the geolocation that came out from that day. So I don't have anything to change. It's just an advance of 2.3 square kilometers. And again, it's an area that's very fluid. There are no Russian soldiers permanently in there anymore, although there are some in Shocherbaki and in other villages nearby. But it is a location that could be exploited because it's not really relevant to the front line and to the main actions right now, which is why they were able to push there in the first place. But holding on to it is something that we need to, get now confirmation of, any sort of elaboration about continued presence over here. We've not seen that yet. We've seen one photo of a flag raising operation, which I always take into account, whether it's Ukrainians or Russians. I'll always give credit for that on the map. But beyond that, I can't really show that they've taken over more than that because there isn't any proof backing that up. Now, where there is proof is in Stepnohirsk. The Ukrainians over here, from Group 10 of the main intelligence directorate, they killed 9 Russian soldiers and took 4 POW in the village of Stepnohirsk. And you can see over here, they captured 1.9 square kilometers of territory, including this eastern flank of the city that was under a lot of threats. So they pushed back the Russians by 1.7 kilometers. That is important because now the apartment high-rises to the south of the town are contested yet again in micro-district number 3. So that's the work of the Russian forces, the Ukrainians over here. And for now, the main outlets that the Russians have are through the center of Stepnohirsk, in between Stepnohirsk and Plavny, I should say. That's it for the frontline updates. Very quickly on the situation in between Trump, Putin, Zelensky. I'll just give a very quick rundown. Trump had the phone call with Putin today. It was reported on really just a couple of hours before it ended up happening. In the call, Trump said that it was productive, so really mirroring a lot of the other conversations he's had in terms of just the general vibe around it. He said that there would be meetings between top advisors of the Russian Federation and the U.S. within the next week, and then there would be a peace summit. That's the way that Orban described it, in Budapest, Hungary. So that will be a meeting directly between Trump and Putin at some time in the future to be scheduled. And Orban, of course, will be mediating it. He has a lot of reasons to be doing that we can get into later on. But this comes as tomorrow Zelensky is actually supposed to be meeting with Trump, and Zelensky is going to be making the case for providing the Ukrainians with a substantial amount of the Tomahawk cruise missiles, which is something that right now, just going off of the vibe of Trump's Truth Social post, is something that has not been decided upon right now, even though Trump has said that he's pretty much made a decision. He said that 2 weeks ago, and that he's now just sort of looking at how and when and where the Ukrainians will use it. So he's pretty much made his mind on it, but in terms of when he will actually sign off on the agreement of sending over the Tomahawks, that's not been determined, and perhaps he can change his mind if he sees progress on the Russian side, and that would be a part of the broader approach to sort of using the Tomahawks as like a lever of pressure against Russia to ensure that they actually go back into negotiations with Ukraine. And you guys can have your own opinions on whether you think it's in earnest or not, but it's not really relevant to just the news cycle and what's being said about that. So Zelensky is going to make the case tomorrow, and the impetus is going to be on him to make the case for why he should be given it. Because after the phone call, Trump's a bit more tame in that regard. So Tomahawks, the United States is estimated to have 4,000 of them in their stockpile, but many of them may be obsolete. The obsolete ones are the ones that the Ukrainians will obviously be receiving first. The newer iterations are obviously kept in the United States. They were used in Iran, for instance. I think like 30 of them were used to strike Isfahan, for instance, in that nuclear site. So those are on the dockets. A couple of dozen of them, as reiterated by Ukrainians, but basically by everybody, are not going to change anything when it comes to the really effectiveness of Ukraine's penetrations into Russia, when it comes to destroying oil refineries, production facilities, anything related to ammo storage, electronic warfare, bunkers, whatever it may be. Like, it's going to require shipments of hundreds in order to overwhelm defenses and to create a consistent attack campaign that can last for maybe months. But even then, that's not a guarantee at all. That's definitely not a guarantee. There's going to be adjustments as with any other system, but it is different, obviously, than the others like the ATACMS because of the range. Because the range of the ATACMS, as we know, is around 300 kilometers. And then for the Tomahawks, it depends on the type because there's Block 2, Block 3, and I think Block 2 is the one with the really extended range of like 2,500. But there are others with like a range of, at a minimum, which is, again, crazy to say, but at a minimum, 1,300. So let's just measure that for the sake of argument so we guys can conceptualize on the map. Let's just place it over here. And then we just zoom out on the map, and you can see that 1,300 kilometers, you're way past Moscow and past various other locations in Russia, all the way to St. Petersburg, maybe even to Astrakhan if you're measuring over here to the southeast, Kazan as well. So it really would depend on the type, but even with the shortest range types, there are a lot of dangers to be posed for all of Western Russia, and so that's a part of why, Putin does have an interest, even if it's lip service, he doesn't have interest in just trying to delay it for as long as possible and steering Trump away from it. And it would still have an effect on U.S.-Russia relationship and the potential for détente. If Trump actually does go forward with it, it would stymie those efforts, as Putin has said. But in terms of anything more, that's far more up in there, and that's not a certainty at all. In terms of the launching platform, that should not be an issue because the Marine Corps has been able to convert the Tomahawks from just a platform that can be launched from submarines or from naval assets to actually one that can be ground launched. And so Ukraine will just receive those, and the Marine Corps has already been preparing for that scenario for a couple of weeks now and disassembling products and entire structures and in trying to get them ready to be sent to Ukraine in the potential case where the green light is given to allow that. But yeah, I know that it's been in the 70s, and ever since the 70s, when those first came into use and when the testing started for the Tomahawks. Like, it's always been known as like a naval-based platform, but the Ukrainians can use the ground one. But that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. We'll be keeping a keen eye on what actually ends up going on between Zelensky and Trump tomorrow, and I'll talk about it. So see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.